Yeah, it's nice to buy a house for more than $100. Or 10, yeah, 10, yeah. I did mine for 100. That was not very good. You know, kind of ripped for that one. You know, she got the $10 thing, but we did a $100 one. Now, our next speaker is also a very distinguished person with a long career of public service. This gentleman has 31 years of active duty in the Air Force and progressively has had more executive, scientific, and technical assignments. Many of them, in directing various organizations in research, development, testing, analysis, and of weapon systems and management of those. It's a lot of responsibility over time that you develop. But after all those years of helping protect this country from our enemies foreign, he didn't stop. Many people retire from public service and they just go try to just enjoy life and kick back and maybe turn inwards perhaps. But this gentleman chose to actually accelerate things by getting involved in the community in a very, very major way. He organized his county, the local political organization in a very effective way to make a real impact on getting good, honest people into positions of public service, people of quality and character that protect our rights and freedoms. And I was speaking with him earlier tonight, and I got to really appreciate more, and I realized how hard that is. I've tried some of those things, and quite frankly, to me, it takes, I can see, it takes a lot of commitment. The same kind of committed mentality that it takes in the military to go catch that Bunker Hill when you got tons of enemies there and superior, force, but with determination and intelligence, can you eventually accomplish your goal with determination. And so he's dedicated himself to public service once again as a private citizen. He's made a lot of contribution. I've heard his name many, many times in the freedom movement, and the great education and the knowledge and awareness that he's bringing to the American people. In fact, I know very few people who come close to him as far as hours that they spend on a weekly basis being on talk radio, reaching out to the public, even though he's well into his 70s and could be golfing if he chooses to. And so, with that kind of a person, it's really a pleasure for me to have company with a person like that, be in the same room with them, and recognize them for the great contribution they are to protecting each of our freedoms and our lives, not only as a soldier, as a brigadier general, but also as a private citizen who really cares, who loves people from the bottom of their heart and will not quit until the day God tells them to quit. And therefore, Freedom Law School, in recognition of your tireless commitment to the restoration and honesty and integrity in government, we recognize you, Benton Partin, as an American freedom hero. Please give a warm hand of
Well, I must say that you got a few more things right today than yesterday morning. I was introduced on a talk show, and someone said, well, General Partin spent 31 years in the Army and 4,000 hours in the Air Force. Quite a difference. Two ladies here were from, I understand, were from Florida, and I just learned recently why they had all this screw up in the voting count in Florida last year, this year. And I learned recently, this is from Phyllis Schlafly, she said the research work has been done. And what happened down there is so many people learn to read without phonetics. They learn the whole language, look, say, dumb method of trying to learn to read. And they could not differentiate between libertarian and Lieberman. That's the case. That is really the case. Can I have the first slide? I promise you tonight that I will not be politically correct, and I did not plan to talk about Oklahoma today, but I saw on the program and the advertisement that I was going to talk about the bombing in Oklahoma, so I will just put up a couple of slides and make a couple of comments. You've all seen the building, and I thought I'd show the building rather than the bombed out building, which is so popular and well publicized around the country. Put on the next slide. The last little episode in my involvement with the Oklahoma investigation was this book came out. It was scheduled to come out 1 month before McVeigh's execution. And I got a call from one of the co-authors, Dan Herbig, 2 months before the execution. So I knew that when I got the call from Herbig that he was not interested in any question from me or any input from his book, from his manuscript, because it would have had to have been the publisher. So he had 2 questions. One, he wanted to know if I still stood by my analysis of the bombing in Oklahoma, and I said I certainly did. There's a million times more information out there then than it was when I first did that analysis. And the second question he asked was, he asked me about other people involved. So I gave him a brief rundown on other people involved other than McVeigh. And I said, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about your interview with Herbig. With, with McVeigh. The book is advertised, and it was advertised then, it was pre-publication advertisement, said the book is based on 75 hours of interview by the 2 authors, 2 newspaper writers in Buffalo, New York. 75 hours of taped interview with McVeigh on death row. That's the way it was advertised. It's in the book. It's the way they've advertised it all over. And he said, his answer to my question, I said, when I'd like to ask him a couple of questions about this interview with McVeigh, he said, I never interviewed McVeigh. Period. I didn't call the other guy and ask him if he interviewed McVeigh, but I thought that was fraudulent. They were guilty of fraudulent advertising, but if you look at the book and read the book, it's pretty much the FBI's line from cover to cover. And in this book, they made the claim that the bomb was made out of 7,000 pounds of ANFO and nitromethane. Now, if you mix nitromethane and ANFO, or ammonium nitrate, you get about the same blast equivalence as you get from TNT. The bomb, what the FBI was saying originally, not originally, but the final figure they came up with was about 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, which is ANFO. And that has about 27% of the blast effectiveness of TNT, just a little bit more than a fourth. So the 7,000 pounds of TNT, of nitromethane and ammonium nitrate would be to have the blast equivalence of about 26,000 pounds of ANFO, all on a 2.5-ton truck. So they have escalated up from the FEMA report that the American Society of Civil Engineers, they went from 4,800 pounds up to 4,000 pounds for TNT, which is the blast equivalence of about 14,000 pounds of ANFO. And now they've upped the thing to about 26,000 pounds. Well, the interesting thing is, there's no crater out there to represent the 16,000, 14,000 pounds, or the 26,000 pounds. So it's just a continuation of lies upon lies upon lies. This is the cover of a FEMA report which was turned out, and they supposedly took this crater size and came to the conclusion that parametrically it would take 4,000 pounds of TNT to give you that size crater. And the crater, they said it was only about a little over half the size they said it was, based on measured photographs. So this report was put out as a propaganda piece. Full card, it's about 3/8 of an inch thick, and you could call FEMA and they would send you a copy free. And the U.S. Government Printing Office doesn't usually put out things like that free because it's a propaganda piece. I just want to point this out about the characteristics of craters, because a crater with respect to the explosives is a much better indicator of the magnitude of the explosive you have there than what you have witnessed on the building. It's much easier to get to. If you take a shape charge and fire into steel, you get a shape about like this. If you fire into lead, you get something like this because the yield strength is so much lower. And if you make a layer of steel and lead, you'll find this lead is driven back under the steel all the way down from this jet where you're putting pressure down. Now, the bomb, this is a picture of a crater in the UK, and you can see the concrete lip sticking over because the clay and gravel and whatnot is rammed back under that rim around the crater. You can see just here you have the same thing. The lead is rammed back under the steel because it's subject to hydrodynamic action from the bigger pressure of the explosive. It's rather interesting to note you have this big crater here, but you see the columns in this building are still standing. It didn't bring it down like it did in the bomb. And I want to make a couple of comments about the TW-800 shoot down. Back in 1956, I was in the laboratory, the Ballistic Research Laboratories at Aberdeen, building the continuous rod warhead for the Beaumont missile. And here you have a test arena. This is one that was done out at China Lake, but I know the test arenas I was sitting, it was the same way. You had a circle of 4x8 sheets of aluminum. The warhead is set off in the middle. This one was probably 125 feet in diameter. And you can see the flashing of the steel hitting the inside on the backside, and you can see it coming through. So in the warhead, this is the extent of the detonation products. There's the end effect here. You can see the energy has been taken out of a lot of the detonation products here because it was accelerating the steel, and the steel rim is out here way ahead of the detonation products, penetrating in a continuous cut. And the thing that's difficult to do in designing a continuous rod warhead is to get it to project in a flat plane, not rotate, and cut continuously. Next chart. And we built continuous rod warheads to get an instantaneous structural kill. If you have an air bomber going after an aircraft carrier or going after a city with an atomic weapon on it, you want to terminate that mission ASAP. And you don't want to punch some holes or damage the aircraft and have it still fly a half hour and get over target. There is the same warhead superimposed up here. I took it and scaled it to the size of a 747 here, TW-800, and I've shown here how the rods come off of that warhead. It's sort of an accordion arrangement, and you project them out at about 5,000 feet a second. Now, when that warhead was down below and off to the left, and it cut through that fuel tank right here, and I'll explain that in a second, but instantaneously, when that rod went through there, you had about, at the altitude of the aircraft was at, you had about 5 pounds per square inch. If you integrate that over pressurization inside, if you integrate that over that 30-foot circle, then you had about 1 million pounds pushing those two sections apart. So it was instantaneous. Of course, the pressure would drop fairly quickly. But while it was still there in position, you had about, and I dare say the front end probably weighed 100,000 pounds or a little less. So with 1 million pounds, the front people in the front end saw about 10 Gs, and the back people saw about a fourth of that. So the seats, they found people, all the seats were just sheared off, and people came out there and seated in the whole seats. They were shot out the back, and as well as both ends, because of the force pushing them away. And then people were found in the water, looked like they were just sitting there in the water. Most everybody had their necks broken. So what happens when you take this much off the nose, say 100,000 pounds on 30, 40 foot leverage, there's no way on earth the tail controls could have had anything to do with it. The whole force of the thing is going to, the nose was going to pitch up violently. It's going to rotate around the lateral axis, and the metallurgical report shows that the wing tips broke off just outside the outboard tanks. And as it turned on up, the angle of attack was far, far exceeding the structural design of the aircraft, and it came apart right there. It broke off in the middle. So if you know the flight dynamics of the situation and you look at the terminal ballistics of the cut across there, see from this point forward has no smoke damage whatsoever. It's perfectly clean. From here to here you have some smoke damage, and from here back you have heavy, heavy fire damage and charring. So if you look at all the facts, the only thing is consistent with the shoot down TW-800. It was taken down with a continuous rod warhead. There's no evidence anywhere that any warhead hit the thing. Here's your cut right across there from the continuous rod warhead. And this cut through here was in the fuel tank, and that's why you had the smoke damage. No, not very high thermal, because once you pull that off, you start tearing up the airplane. Next shot. I want to make a couple of comments about Waco. I did a court forensic on Waco. This is the church records vault. There was a demolition charge set off on top of that church records vault. There were 28 women and children in there. And it burned and burned, and there was a tremendous cover-up on Waco, just like there was on TW-800 and on the bombing in Oklahoma. But let's go on to the next chart. If you look at all of these incidences over here, if you look at every one of them, there was a tremendous amount of civil apathy. How many people know about the details on this? Media cover-up on every one of them, government cover-up like crazy on every one of them, and there's some indication of some entrapment or sting operation. The New York 1983 New York World Trade Center, it was just an FBI sting operation, counterterrorism sting operation. And there's evidence of some entrapment or sting operation in all those. Of course, that was a missile shoot down. Now, whose was it? There's been some publications out there trying to blame it on friendly fire, but the very next day I got a call from a CIA source. I asked that he was sent to New York to try to identify the captain of a fishing trawler who had bumped a submarine that they had been tracking down from the St. Lawrence Seaway. And from all the research and knowledge that I know of, I think there were 2 missiles fired, one from the submarine and one from the surface vessel. Who the submarine was, it was a Foxtrot submarine. There are many countries that have the Foxtrots, the Russians make them. The United States has never put missiles, air defense missiles on any of the submarines, but the Soviets have. In 1955, I started the Focused Energy Weapons Program. 1957, this is a gentleman named Wynne Salisbury. He's one of the most brilliant scientists this country's ever turned out. He holds a string of patents a mile long. And this gentleman is now in his latter years with Alzheimer's, but here you see him burning steel in a waveguide, in front of a waveguide, and he's made a little comments on there. He got involved with me when I started the Focused Energy Weapons Program. And in 1958, I signed a contract for the first contract to build a laser. There were several efforts. Salisbury had an effort for, and we did produce coherent optical frequency energy called Project Card, and we had coherent energy of Project Card before the laser. Next chart. And if you talk about extrapolating and looking ahead, this system is being put together in the hangar right now, and it's taken twice as long as it should have. But here you have a big, powerful laser on a 747 with the capability of shooting down intermediate range ballistic missiles. Let's go on. Now, much of my military career was spent in weapons development, and started off with the munitions kind of things, missiles and guidance technologies. And when you look at bringing in a new weapon system, something like, say, the B-1, you're going to take 10 years. When you lay down the requirement for that system and specify what the requirements are for that system, it's going to be 10 years before you have the system in operation. And from the, you may have, for something like a stealth aircraft, you may have had 10 years of research work before you lay down the requirements for a system. So, what is your crystal ball for looking ahead 10 years? And then if you're going to keep the system in the inventory for 20 years or 30 years, gosh, we've been flying the B-52 for about 45 years. But traditionally, you may keep a weapon system around for 20 to 30 years. So what crystal ball do you use looking ahead 30 to 40 years in the future to determine what those operational characteristics should be in the weapon system? What kind of operational scenario 20, 30 years in the future? Most of us don't like to plan ahead even 5 years. If you're going to be a kid, and if you're a kid and you're going to plan to be a surgeon, you better think about a 15 or 20-year plan. But in the weapons development business, what crystal ball do you use for looking ahead 30, 40 years? I have never found but two things useful. Two things. One is an extrapolation of technology. And it's a science in itself, and I think we've done a very good job of extrapolating technology. Second thing is, I have found that the program of the Third International gives you a very good predictive basis for anticipating what kind of operational scenarios you're going to be involved in. So those two things, the technology and the program of the Third International, are the predictive basis that I found were about the only things that were useful for long-range planning of major systems. Now, most of us like to look at the world, the real world, as it is. And here's, from our space program, here's a nice pretty picture of Earth. And here's Africa, here's the Cape, which is now a communist country. You have a new communist government in South Africa. They've taken over. And you can see Somalia here, which they were busy taking Somalia over many years ago. Since they have, the communist government has taken over here, they've integrated the forces down there that were fighting in South Africa with the South African forces, and now they have taken the Congo, recombined with Zaire, recombined with the Congo, and Mandela was very instrumental in getting a long-term, old-time communist heading that up. He has recently been killed and replaced by his son. But they are conducting operations all the way up into Sudan, and they are moving to help consolidate the communist world in Africa today. Why are they doing this? Because there are people out there who see the world differently. They want to see the entire world transformed into a world socialist, communist system, whatever you want to call it. And there's not one square inch of the world that is exempt from it. And the program of the Third International is what is laid out to make that transformation in detail. Okay, next chart. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because if you don't understand the program of the Third International, you're very confused and can be very confused about what's going on. There's a set of documents. There are 3 documents. These are the documents of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, the Board of Governors of the Communist International. It's not the people who run Russia, it's the people who orchestrate the global program, the ECCI, Executive Committee Communist International. And this series of documents go from 1919 until 1943. Well, 1919 is when the Third International was founded in Russia. And it ends in 1943 because in 1943 the Russians were trying to get Lend-Lease from the United States during World War II. And there were people like Senator Taft and some of the smart guys in our own Senate and House who were not willing to give the Russians Lend-Lease unless they would agree to disband the ECCI. Because these people knew and understood what the ECCI was all about. And the Russians of the communist world agreed to disband the ECCI in name only. They said, sure, we'll disband it. Earl Browder, who was head of the Communist Party of the United States, later said they didn't change a thing. They didn't change the marquee on the building. They didn't move, they didn't do a thing. They said, sure, we'll do it. Typical. But these documents cover all of the promulgations of the Executive Committee of the Communist International from 1919 until 1943. The organization has had its continuum, but not in the form of the ECCI. Volume number 2 covers the period from 1923 to 1928. Now, in 1928, they had the Sixth Party Congress. It's a global party congress in which they approved the program of the Third International. But in 1919, they set up a think tank operation to develop the program of the Third International. And this was made up of their best and brightest from around the world. They weren't people just in Russia, they were people from all over the world. Next chapter. So, the document itself says, it is the program of the Communist International for the fight for the world proletarian dictatorship, the program for the struggle for world communism. And that is exactly as it's stated right up front. The commission that developed this was the Program Commission for the Executive Committee of the Communist International over a 9-year period. They worked from 1919 to 1928. They had 11 world plenary sessions in the development of the program. And it was adopted at the Sixth Party Congress in Moscow, September 1st, 1928. There were 532 delegates from around the world, 25 from the United States. 20 voting members, 25 people from the United States. This was really sort of a precursor to the United Nations. It was an orchestrated, globally organized effort, and people from almost every country in the world, the numbers depended upon the voting strength of the party in each of those countries. Now, being in the military, I have concentrated, my number one concern about the program of the Third International was their effect and efforts toward transforming the country and removing our national sovereignty and folding us into a global police state. But the program covers almost every endeavor you could think of. For example, this is an exact quote from their little section on trade and credit. Calls for the nationalization of all private banks, all gold securities deposits transferred to the state, centralize all banks in order to one central bank, nationalization of wholesale trade, transfer organizations to the Soviet state, monopoly of foreign trade, and the cancellation of public debt. Well, the World Trade Organization is set up to provide this and this global wholesale trade. Another area, which is not having anything to do with the national sovereignty, is in their means for exerting ideological influence within the program. Nationalization of all printing works, monopoly of newspapers and publishing, nationalization of the cinema and the theater, nationalize all means of producing goods for intellectual purposes. So in other words, that's all your books and stuff. Now, let's get back to the program of the Third International with respect to transferring the sovereignty of this country into this global hierarchical police state. The program that's the title of the section. It's in one of those books, and on there say the program is about a half-inch thick. And that's the date it was adopted. One of the major things in that program was what they call wars of national liberation. And it's such a major portion of the program, they published another document detailing the strategy and tactics of wars of nationalization, wars of nationalization. And this is that document. Thesis of the Revolutionary Movement, the colonial and semi-colonial countries. Colonial countries, you know what they are. Semi-colonial countries are free and independent nations that fall under the dominant influence of a major power. For example, in the Western Hemisphere, everything except the United States was considered, everything in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, was considered a semi-colonial country. They're free and independent nations, but the United States was the dominant influence and dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. They always considered the United States a colonial country because of the oppressed nations within, the blacks, the Chicanos, American Indians, and some Oriental continentals. Now, this covered the program. This is an amplification of wars of national liberation. There's another ECCI resolution on the Negro question adopted at the same time, which deals with the transformation of Africa and the use of the black community in this country and accomplishment. Next. Now what they did was they divided the world into 4 different kinds of countries, 3 different kinds of countries. The capitalist countries, Western Europe, Australia, and Japan. All free and open societies, private businesses, long time, democratic countries to a certain extent, major extent. And so all of these countries were to be transitioned to socialism by way of Fabian socialism and democratic processes. And today, most all of these countries, particularly Western Europe, most all of the chiefs of state in Western Europe are today socialist. Then you had the countries of medium level of development. These are countries that had a good balance between business, industry, and agriculture. They had a historical, solid foundation in government. And these were all the East European countries as we know them today. Then everything else in the world was considered colonial or semi-colonial. Everything, the whole world, except those countries. And all of these countries were to be transitioned to socialism by a war of national liberation. Now, at the end of World War II, Hitler and Stalin and Churchill were very anxious to transfer a lot of these countries that had gained their independences, and then at the end of World War II, they had the preparatory phase of a war of national liberation underway, and they pushed to give these countries their freedom. The Russians were doing it because they knew with their war, with the war of national liberation, how they were going to take those countries, and they were very interested in setting them up in a more vulnerable position. And they set up what they call a block within strategy. And these were countries that had gained their independence after World War II. And they came up with a block within strategy. They applied it first on an experimental basis in Egypt. That was Nasser's operation. So Nasser brought Egypt into socialism with the so-called block within strategy. And the block within strategy, in great details, this is post-1928. It was spelled out in great detail in the World Marxist Review, and how they set it up, and how they did it, and how they ran it. The second place they applied the block within strategy was in Iraq. And to think Iraq is anything one another, Castro, Cuba, you're kidding yourself. And they did the same thing similarly in Syria and several other countries in the Middle East. And much of this was going on while we were spending $25 billion in combat consumables in Vietnam. So they were taking much of that. Now, who orchestrates this? Who orchestrates and runs this thing? Who is they? The they, from 1919 to 1943, was the Comintern, and the primary body doing it was the ECCI, the Executive Committee of Communist International, made up of people from all over the world. Post-World War II, they changed the name to the Cominform. After 1943, the Communist Information Bureau. They still had the ECCI, but it became the Cominform. Then in the 50s, they changed the name again to the International. I think it was 1956. They changed the name again to the International Department. Same organization, same locale, same people, they just changed the name. This was after the McCarthy hearings. Communism was getting a bad name, so they changed the name to the International Department. When Trudeau, if you've ever read the Canadian Intelligence Digest, you know that Trudeau was one of the most articulate Marxist-Leninists in the Western Hemisphere. When he stepped down as Prime Minister in Canada, he went to Moscow. What did he do? He went to work for the International Department. One of the key guys in setting up the CIA was about to be exposed. He was a UK guy over here. He was a double agent. And when he was about to be caught, he skipped country and went to Moscow and went to work for the International Department. So the International Department was orchestrated by, run by people that best advice from all around the world. Now, what has happened? The same organization and people. Now you have, it's the Gorbachev Foundation. With perestroika implemented around 1990s, 88, 89, 90, you know they were going to do something, because the idea of the International Department orchestrating things on a global basis for transforming the whole world into a social system, they would change the name or do something to remove its identity. So they set up the Gorbachev Foundation. I had the opportunity to interview a fairly high Soviet official. I've been instrumental in getting his son placed. He wanted his son to graduate from my American high school. And I was instrumental in getting his son and a family over here to take care of him while he was going to high school, because they had a son who was studying Russian, and they thought the deep immersion would be good for him. But anyway, I had the opportunity to interview this guy. We had an interpreter there, but we didn't need the interpreter because he spoke very good English. And I went over this sequence of things, the control of the orchestration of the global program, and he was da. And I got down to this one, the Gorbachev Foundation. He says, well, I'm not sure about that. He says, I'll have to check that out and get back with you. Of course, he never got back with me. He said, but I'll tell you this. The Gorbachev Foundation is building a brand new 1 kilometer square office complex in Moscow. He said, I don't know where they're getting the money, but they're well funded. I said, they're probably getting the money from the same place the Gorbachev Foundation at the Presidio got theirs, and that's from the Fortune 500. So they are building it, and so you have the Gorbachev Foundation is in Moscow, but Gorbachev Foundation USA is at the Presidio. The Gorbachev Foundation Berlin, Germany is in Berlin. So you have these Gorbachev Foundations all around the world in the more predominant countries, just like you had CPUSA, CPUS Canada. It's sort of the same thing. All of the same. Next year. By the way, the gentleman used his excuse coming over here visiting his son. He hit 39 of the 50 states, and he hit every country in North and South America and those visits back and forth. So he was an up-and-coming, bright young guy. He had been the governor of Kamchatka. He had been an admiral in the Soviet Navy. He was a member of the upper house of the Duma, and he had a son flying off of a Soviet carrier. This is the ECCI as of 1935, and I just put this up here. Some of these people have on the presidium, if the P is there and an S, they're on the secretariat. But you see, these are people from all over the world. Browder, he was from the United States. Foster was from the United States. Florida and Togliatti, or Nicoli, were from Italy. Coming over here, Gottwald was from Germany. Some of the others you know. Mao Zedong, where is he? Chow En-lai is here. Mao Zedong is somewhere.
No.
Yeah, where's Mao Zedong? So you see, these people were the global leaders of the parties from each of their countries working around the same conference table. And then we come up with the bright idea that communism is dead, and Soviet, Russia, and China are at each other's throat when they have been orchestrating things around the world in a very, very unitary fashion, but with a certain amount of operational independence. Now, what is the War of National Liberation? When you look at what I had said earlier about the capitalist countries, then the East European countries, they all went as a consequence of World War II. But during the 30s, they were trying to pick off those countries in Eastern Europe. Poland fell, Hungary fell, but they couldn't hold them, they fell back. They finally invaded Finland, remember, and Finland gave them a hard time. And then they split Poland with Adolf Hitler, and we were off in World War III. But much of World War III instigation stemmed from moving the East European countries. Now, for wars of national liberation, they address it in the documents of the ECCI as a three-phase program, but I always put phase 0 up there because it's something they do. They have to do it, and they explain it, and they determine the basis of the struggle. In other words, what is the schism inside the country that you're going to use to exacerbate a conflict situation? And you organize a revolutionary council in that country to do it. And then you go through a long-term preparatory phase, a period of escalating violence, and a period of exploitation. Next chart. Now, I put this chart up, and I made this chart to sort of show this. It is a continuum. It's not a discontinuous thing, it is a continuum. You establish what the basis of the struggle is. I put over here is the level of effort and what's the witnessable effort. This is a witnessable effort, and this is sort of the level of effort. Phase 1 is the preparatory phase. It's non-violent, it's organizational, it's peaceful. And then you move at a certain time, you move from the preparatory phase to the period of escalating violence. And I will talk about each one of these phases. And the United States is right here. We are just entering the period of escalating violence. Then you move over to Colombia in South America is in the period of escalating violence now. South Africa has just moved from the period of escalating violence into the period of exploitation. You have the communist chief of state down there. Venezuela, I might say, has a new communist chief of state, and they're flooding Venezuela now with Cubans. But the level of this, you could sort of indicate this is a level of the fatalities or the organization and liquidating people, because even though South Africa has moved into the period of exploitation, the number of people being killed every year in South Africa continues to grow. Next chart. Now, what is this preparatory phase? If you look at the program of the Third International, in the preparatory phase, these are some of the things you do. Infiltration. We've had open borders. Are we a victim of this? You bet we are. Recruiting people into the organization. Organizing. Media control. Boy, if you ever want to see media control, I don't think anything should be media control in this country any more than the cover-up at the TW-800 and the bombing in Oklahoma and what happened in Waco. You exacerbate this conflict thesis. You establish a revolutionary justification. There was a guy by the name of Manning Johnson wrote a book called Color Communism and Common Sense back around the 50s. He broke with the Communist Party. They killed him. And, but he's told how he was a member of the Executive Committee of the Communist Party of the United States, and he operated out of the Philadelphia area. And exacerbating this conflict thesis, they go into Philadelphia, the very large black community, and say, why don't you guys go out and build your own black-only controlled bank? Or your own black-only controlled shopping center. Quit giving your money to white people. And they work around behind the scenes to keep them from getting the zoning, keep them from getting the financing, anything to keep it from happening. Doing what? Revolutionary justification, fooling the elite. Peaceful demonstrations, propaganda, disinformation, subvert the culture, religion, education, politics, values, the military, law enforcement. You undermine business, industry, and agriculture, and the family. Do those things so that you make them not workable. You subvert institutions, disseminate disinformation, employ strategic deception. Probably one of the biggest strategic deception items over the 50s and 60s and 70s was the Sino-Soviet split. Strategic disinformation effort out there today is communism is dead. You undermine the economy, control of money. That's the Federal Reserve. You remove the death penalty. Why do you remove the death penalty? Because when you move into the next phase, if you get caught doing some of the things in terrorism, you may get a death penalty, then you have nothing to fear, because when the revolution goes to completion, except being locked up, and when the revolution goes to completion, then you have hopes of becoming another Mandela or Castro or Commissar or some high official. So you want to remove the death penalty. The last thing here before you move is you want to disarm the citizenry. Why? Because you just think, how many people would it take to take over your little hometown if your hometown was disarmed and the people were coming in with AK-47s and gas cans and crowbars? How many would it take to burn and sack your hometown, and liquidate a third of the people? How many would it take if the people were armed? It's a vast, vast difference. So that's why it's so easy to move into the period of escalating violence and move from there into the period of exploitation, because if you disarm the people, then it is a very easy thing to do. So you disarm the citizenry. And if you go back and look at the popular media in this country after the bombing in Oklahoma, the #1 thrust of the left-wing media in this country was get that counterterrorism bill out of the Senate and the House and signed by the President and disarm the people, get rid of your Second Amendment rights. The Senate rammed it through without even going to committee. The House got enough opposition out there, Congressman Barnes, some others. They really changed some of the major features of the bill and took out some of the worst things. They still got the bill through. I think it's a bad bill in many respects, but they did not get rid of your Second Amendment rights. Now, ecology. Gus Hall, who was head of the Communist Party in the United States for probably, what, 30 years, 40 years, forever, he died not too long ago. He wrote a book back here, 29 years ago, it was 1972, entitled Ecology, Can We Survive Under Capitalism? Next one. Now, here's the problem. He says right up front, the crisis of the environment, like other crises, has its roots in the inherent characteristics of capitalism, the drive for private profits which insist on the exploitation and racism, and promotes war and domestic violence, also includes the utterly reckless disregard for natural resources and the consequent contamination of the environment. In other words, the private profit motive of private industry, private business, is the problem. What's the solution? The ultimate solution, of course, is the creation of a planned society in which the quest for profits has been abolished and the results of our science and technology are used for the benefits of the masses of the people of our nation. Or one of the most polluted places in the whole world is now the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. So the problem is private profits. The solution is socialist, planned socialist economy. Next chart. Now, why did he write the book to start with? Here it is. Last thing in the book. He said, it is hoped that this booklet will be a factor in helping the millions who are getting the experience of struggle and the movement against pollution to become a new force in the transition from capitalism to socialism. In other words, you have an organized work structure out there around the world. Who's the big head of this? Who heads the Green Cross? Who? Gorbachev. Right. Next. Now, here's a chart. I want to talk about exacerbating the conflict thesis. In Canada, the conflict thesis is the French separatist movement. In Ireland, it's the Protestant versus the Catholic. And the communists try to control both sides. Same thing here. In Rwanda, it was the Hutu versus the Tutsi. It wasn't communist versus anti-communist. It was Hutu versus the Tutsi. And also the animists versus the Christians. South Africa, it's racial and tribal. It was racial and tribal. It is now, they've taken over. In the United States, it's colonial. Patriots versus the oppressed nations within. The oppressed nations within. That's what they call them. That's their terminology. A couple of comments about some of the exacerbation strategy. Remember Lincoln Rockwell back in Goldwater's time? He had this neo-Nazi group here in town. Before one of the, I think it's House Un-American Activities Committee. Somebody testified that Rockwell was a neo-Nazi crowd, and they always went out to the airport when Goldwater was going or coming to greet him or send him off and trying to identify with him. One young man testified before one of the committees, congressional committees. He said that he was offered $250,000 a year to set up a similar group in Boston. So here you have the Marxists, the communists in this country setting up neo-Nazi groups for effective purposes. Manning Johnson, I told you about revolutionary justification. Southern Poverty Law Center, Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama. Morris Lee's operation. They turn out their literature. They group the Christians, the militia, patriots, populists, constitutionalists with the Nazis, neo-Nazis, the KKK, and the cults. In other words, there's no enemy from the left. And some of his literature you see getting involved in military training situations today. I think Manning, he's sitting there with an operating capital of about $50 million, and I think he's a bad name now. Control of public opinion. Let me just say, I was invited out by ABC affiliate called a program called Extra. They invited me out to California. They sent me a first-class ticket, met me at the airport when we had bought on white was in limousines. And the vehicle was mine, and the driver for the evening carried me all over Hollywood and showed me all around. Everything you could think to eat or drink in that vehicle. Next morning, they picked me up in that same vehicle and carried me over to the studio there in Hollywood. And we did this program. A month later, dealing with the bombing in Oklahoma. And I felt they had a lot of exposure to me. There was a lot of talking, a lot of filming where I wasn't talking, but interaction with me and the host. They had 2 producers working with me, getting everything set up. And I thought they did a fairly good job in presenting my analysis of the bombing in Oklahoma. And Lyndon came the host, and he had a mission. So we had a lot more exposure. When the thing was shown across the United States on a Sunday, about a month afterwards, they made some very good points about that. Let me make the points about the technical impossibility of the reach of the bomb against those heavy reinforced columns. They let me make the points about the impossibility of the asymmetry in the target from one single point of detonation. And they let me shoot down that FEMA report, which I pointed out before. And when it was shown across the country on that Sunday, they let me make all those points. And then they wound the thing up thus. Said, well, General Partin is a career military officer. He's not an engineer. Therefore, he really doesn't understand these things. So what is the purpose? Give me all this exposure. Here's what this idiot has to say. He's totally incompetent to make such judgments or analyses. To do what?
Discredit.
Sure, discredit. That was the purpose. The whole thing was to the purpose. They knew I had a BS in chemical engineering, a master's in aeronautical engineering, 2 years in armament engineering, completed academics with a PhD. And I spent 25 years in research and development, all the way from the laboratory to the Office of Secretary of Defense. But did that make any difference? I called them up and I said, hey, you guys lied. You completely misrepresented things, and they demanded a retraction and changed that, because the next week they were showing the seismologist, Dr. Brown. And they said, well, we let you make your points, didn't we? I said, sure. And you turned right around and tried to discredit me. You were lying, you flat lied. I got a hold of some lawyers and said, well, you can sue them, but because you're considered both public people, you may win a $1 judgment. It'll cost you everything you got. Well, another area, a big area in exacerbating strategies is in psychiatry and psychology, and it's a big area itself. And if you're nobody here's, how many of you have read Psychopolitics? Psychopolitics. There's a training manual on the use of psychopolitics. It's massive, massive, massive. People know very, very little about it. Another disinformation. Here's Desmond Tutu in the National Cathedral less than 2 years ago, Christmas Eve program. What is he saying? He was one of the big communist leaders in the revolution in South Africa. If we believe we're a family, we should not be discussing what to do with budget surpluses. We'd say the ethic of family applies. Each from each according to their ability, to each according to their... Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Desmond Tutu. National Cathedral Christmas Eve program in Washington, D.C. Christmas Eve before that. Now, talk about getting rid of guns and disarmament, getting rid of your guns. In phase one of the preparatory phase of the War of National Liberation. Here's a chart that was made up showing all of these genocides, starting with in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Union, Germany, China, Uganda, Cambodia, and Rwanda. The dates, these are the targets: Christians, Armenians, Christians, Jews in Germany, Christians, and the Gypsies. And you come right on down. If you look at almost every one of these, one of the primary targets in all of these things is the Christians. Almost all of them. Here's the number of people that were murdered. I think I listed from Rwanda is 500,000 people, 600,000. Actually, it's about 1 million people. About 1 million people. And you had more people killed in just a few months in Rwanda with machetes than you had killed in all atomic warfare in the history of the world. And what did anybody do about it? Kofi Annan, the chief of the United Nations today, at that time he was over the United Nations military operations, and when they started killing the people in Rwanda, he withdrew all the United Nations forces. He didn't supplement them, he just withdrew it. Date of the gun control, and here's the legislation that was set up as gun control. So genocide, who are they after? You look at who are they after. Next year. Okay, I got a husband. Phase 2 of War of National Liberation. This is a period of escalating violence, which we're moving into. Political assassinations, bank robberies. You talk about political assassinations, if you look at all these terrorist things we've had, Oklahoma, Ruby Ridge, Waco, associated with every one of them, we've had all kinds of people who have been murdered. How many in Oklahoma, Charles?
About a dozen.
About a dozen. Nobody admits that. Bank robberies. Brazil, one of the alleged John Doe number 2s. He's picked up for not participating in the bombing of Oklahoma. He was picked up for bank robbing. Kidnapping for ransom. Terrorism. Terrorism plays a very, very big role in the second phase, period of escalating violence. Intimidation, demoralization, establish that you have no mercy, and if you do this, you establish you have no mercy, and then you can get obedience and less resistance. Destabilization with refugees, inflow of people and equipment and money. I know people all over this country have sent me pictures and fun pictures of white painted foreign armor being shipped into this country on railroad trains half a mile long. Limited warfare. You take the limited warfare to the level of violence all the way up till you have a transfer of power to the Revolutionary Council. You had, when Castro came down from the mountains, that's where you were. He took over power right around Christmas of 1959, 1st of 60, next chapter. These are the things in the period of escalating violence. Now, speaking about terrorism, the FBI made a major study right toward the end of 1999 to determine what the terrorist threat was going to be for the new millennium. And they came up with Project Megiddo. Where's Megiddo? Megiddo was the tell in the Valley of Armageddon in Israel. There's the tell. It dates back to way back. I've been there. So Project Megiddo is the FBI's official assessment of the terrorist threat for the new millennium. And who was the terrorist threat? Christians, the Christian right. And I've made this comment many times when people say, well, how about the Christian left? Who is the Christian left? Is it? Well, how about the Unitarians? They don't make any pretense of being Christian. Okay, next chart. Now, if you look at the things, here's an outline. It's a 32-page document. Here's what they talked about. You got an executive service, summary, introduction. When does the new millennium begin? A blueprint for action, the Turner Diaries, interpretations of the Bible, apocalyptic beliefs, New World Order, conspiracy theories, global gun control, Christian identity movement, white supremacy, militias. See, this is what they were addressing for their terrorist threat. And if you read the thing, it reads like it was written by Morris Dees from Montgomery, Alabama, next chart, with Southern Poverty Law Center. So that's less than 2 years ago. Less than 2 years ago, the terrorist threat was the Christian right. Now you see nothing mentioned but the Muslim world, right? Then it said, first we take Eastern Europe, then the masses of Asia, then we'll encircle the United States, which will be the last bastion of capitalism. We shall not have to attack it. The United States will fall like grapefruit into our hands. Next chart. Next chart. Now, the basic seminal document on terrorism was written by Leon Trotsky. It was when he was head of the military. It was published in 1921. He was the head of the Soviet forces in Russia. There was still fighting going on between the Reds and the Whites in Russia at the time. But this is the seminal document on terrorism. It was published in, this one is published under the title The Defense of Terrorism, but there was another document prepared about the same time by a guy named Trotsky who used the title Communism and Terrorism, and Trotsky named his book Communism and Terrorism. So to separate the two and make a distinction, they changed the name of this one, Trotsky's book, and published it in Defense of Terrorism. Next chart. And the basic thesis of this document is if you don't support terrorism, you don't support the leftist cause. Now, here are some of the just brief quotes from that book. He says, terrorism is a merciless struggle. It's an insolent challenge to the balance of forces. In other words, when the correlation of forces are against you, you can still go out and execute terrorist tactics when you are in a minority. It gives the life of the terrorist a purpose and a high goal. Some of those are dead now, right? It exploits the flabbiness and rottenness and helplessness of the middle classes and their parties. The first condition, I think a lot of people would agree with that about Clinton. The first condition of salvation is to tear the weapons of domination out of the hands of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, you're really talking about the middle classes. There's no other way of breaking the class will of the enemy except the systematic and energetic use of violence. It introduces into the struggle the first elements of savagery. It kills individuals and intimidates thousands. Bolsheviks, making use of red terror, betrayed the principle of the sacredness of human life. Did you see this in Rwanda? Introduces the struggle the first elements of savagery. If anybody's seen the films that were made on Rwanda, it's exactly what it is. Colombia today is in the period of escalating violence. Large sections, 40,000 square miles, have been turned over to the communists in Colombia. 40,000. You got to break down the families and the Christians and pastors, and then people are leaving Colombia. And also they're getting in a good crop of Cubans down there also. This is a publication. This is really was an AP report. How many have seen these pictures? Associated Press. It came to me on a publication out of the UK, out of England. And here is a submarine. It's being put together at the 7,000-foot level in Colombia. For what? For drug hauling what? And in the report that it came out in, the guy was showing, this Christopher Story published his 11 intelligence documents. He's showing that in the Soviet Union, they still, in their papers, everything is still called themselves the Soviet Union, in their papers. But this submarine is a kit made in Russia. It's a submarine kit. They're assembling it down there. It's a brand new kit. It's 100 feet long, 11 feet in diameter, and it can hold 200 tons of cocaine. I might say it can hold 200 tons of weapons, too, because they're going to be playing a big role in the liberation struggles throughout South America. These are two other views of the submarine. It's a very good size flying. It will cruise at 300 feet below sea level. Well, this is what's going on in Indonesia. Remember back in the 60s when General Suharto, they pulled the coup, they tried to take over the country. The communists made a big push to pull a coup, and it was orchestrated to a major extent by Sukarno. And between midnight and dawn, they killed tens of thousands of people. They liquidated the leadership in business, industry, agriculture, the military, business, education, everything. Tens of thousands of people between midnight and dawn. General Suharto was able to get an armored brigade. When they went to his house to kill him, he had a walkie-talkie. He fled. They wiped out his family. He got a walkie-talkie. They brought an armored brigade into Jakarta. They turned the revolution around. But the reports were over the next 10 years they prosecuted and executed about 300,000 people. But I talked to a friend who was spent about 15 years in that country. During that period of time, he said it was closer to 1.5 million people, 1 million to 1.5 million people who were prosecuted and executed. That's the fourth largest country in the world. And now you have Sukarno's daughter is the new president in Indonesia. And they're hunting down and going and raiding villages of Christians and wiping them out. And here's some of the Boy Scouts and the Revolutionary efforts, all raising their clenched fists. So Sukarno's daughter, Megawati, what a name, Megawati Sukarno. She is the new president down there, and you're going to see Indonesia falling further and further into the communist rule. Phase 3 of War of National Liberation, period of exploitation. In other words, once you have taken that country, you use that country as a base of operation against the next target country. Just like Castro since 1959, 1960, has been in the period of exploitation, funding aid, weapons and stuff into the Middle Americas, bringing those people into Cuba for training. And I remember years and years ago, probably when I was a major, some very senior person said they had already shipped 65,000 people back in the United States that had been taken to Cuba for their military training. Phase 3, liquidate the opposition, liquidate or re-educate potential opposition. You work toward perfecting the socialist man. You provide a base of operations for the next target countries. You support the World Commonwealth of Independent States. That is what the communist world, they had hoped in their program. The only date you see in the program is by the year 2000, they had planned to have a global World Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. The former Soviet Union calls themselves today the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States. The United Nations is a CIS, a Commonwealth of Independent States. A Commonwealth is a loose federation. And they plan to have this by the year 2000. If you read their trade literature today in the World Marxist Review and in the Economist, you see they're admitting that they've slipped 5 or 6 years. We work toward the perfectibility of the Socialist Public Act. World Commonwealth of Independent States, public ownership of property, and eliminate all religions. Venezuela, you got a new president down there. He's a communist. Christians are all piling out, pastors are fleeing the country. Thousands of Cubans have been brought in to advise the citizen security. It's a budding police state, and Chavez is planning a 1 million man armed forces battalion of Venezuela. Now, from this World Commonwealth of Independent States, they hope to have by the year 2000, and they're very close to that. The future. 2000, this World Commonwealth of Independent States. Then they move into what they call globalism. In other words, you set up these global cartels for the production and distribution of goods and services. There is a global cartel in existence today for all diamond trade. Harry Oppenheimer in South Africa has been running this global diamond cartel. They've been processing and selling all the diamonds out of Russia and everywhere else. And he takes great pride in boasting that he and his big money had a major influence in funding the revolutionary struggle and the transfer of power in South Africa. Harry Oppenheimer. So he established global cartels for the production and distributions of goods and services, and that's what they are working to. Global cartels for shipping. China's getting close to that for surface shipping. We have very, very little surface shipping in this country today. A global cartel in machine tools, a global cartels in the aviation industry. So if you're going to establish a global operation, you have to organize down in certain areas. And then they move into this, you have, with these global cartels, you can set up under the WTO, World Trade Organization, a World Socialist Division of Labor. And that's the function of the WTO. You read it. Then you have the withering away of the state. And then you go to this global hierarchy of regional governments. And is this country primed today to go to a regional government system? It's already in the public law. Just needed a national emergency. The president has already declared a national emergency. He just hasn't implemented all of the elements of it. Then you go to this new world order. And that's what they call it. The end game of this global program is the new world order. Just that clear and simple. They spell it out in a half a dozen different ways. They call it the New World Socialist Order, the New World Order, or New Order. But it's the New World Order is probably most one. This world without nations, a world without nationalities, a world without borders, a world without war, and a world without competition. Competition is a very bad word in the communist vocabulary. This world communism, this is what they call communism. Everything else by far is there. We are building socialism, we're building democracy, we're building communism. But you don't have communism until you get to this particular point. And once you get to this point, then you can have this, what they call the new socialist man. Now, the big new term today is what? One individual said we should characterize the new administration as the communitarian administration. And this is a new politically correct term. You're calling it communitarian. You're talking about the communists, the socialists, the globalists, the collectivists, the totalitarians, and it's interdependence. Interdependence. You see a lot about interdependence, but that goes back in the development and evolution of the Communist World Program. When you establish this World Trade Organization out there, where you have a World Socialist Division of Labor, you establish totally interdependence. I know in the Soviet Union they had a total interdependence in the research and development area. Country A would be working in this area, country B in another area, country C in another. So you had all this interdependence throughout the Soviet Union. Now, the communist world has always played with words. You can define away your problem. Webster's Dictionary, 1962, that's the big thick one. Okay? Says communism in 12 words, one who believes in or is a member of a communistic community. That's the communitarian. Now, in 1993, Webster says, of or relating to a social organization in small cooperative, partially collectivist communities. What does that mean? Yes. If you look at the transfer of power and sovereignty from freedom and independence into the socialist system, this was done some time ago. I used to keep an update one of these myself, and I have not kept it up for the last decade. But if you go back and look at this, you have during Lenin's time, you had all these countries that transitioned in his so-called dominant theory. In Stalin's first 22 years, you had these years. And in Stalin's 5-year, all these countries went over. Khrushchev's, all these went over. Brezhnev, all these went over. And Gorbachev, all these went over. And these, at the time this thing was prepared back in the 80s, all of these countries are now crossed over. Every one of them went to socialism. Next year. President George Bush, Sr., said back in 1989, he said he wants to get the Soviets reintegrated into the family of nations. That will be the goal of my administration. Now, if you look at the program of the Third International and their orchestration through the ECCI and all down through the chain of command, and what they have done, the countries they have fallen over, do you think you have a chance of a snowball, you know where, of doing this? Condoleezza Rice, who is his national security advisor, says the administration's strategy on Beijing is to integrate China's economy internationally with the goal of eventually causing its political dictatorship to reform. You think that's going to happen? Looking at what they have organized and put, I said, it's like putting a rattlesnake in your baby soft cozy bed and expecting the rattlesnake to reform. When the people are in your organizations and working in your organizations, just like right here, 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, a racist fire supposedly from the Ku Klux Klan, is where it's claimed from, turned out to be a KGB forgery designed to disrupt the games. So in the name of the KKK, the KGB turned out a piece of paper. There was a dinner conversation on Martha's Vineyards. Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He reported in February 2nd, 1999, issue of Salon, he said, President Clinton was asked by one of the guests who he thought his enemies were. He replied his immediate and abrupt, his reply was immediate and abrupt. My only enemy is the right-wing religious fundamentalist. Is that consistent with the FBI's assessment of the terrorist threat? Marquez stated the pronouncement ended the meeting. Next chart. Here are some pertinent facts. From 1955 to 85, the Sino-Soviet split hoax, or strategic disinformation program, you want to call it that, existed. And it had, I wrote a book back in 1964, and I listed 50 payoffs to the implementation of the program of the Third International. We think it convinced the mind of the West that this was the case. It wasn't. So that was 85. And from 91 to the present, communism is dead, has replaced that as the #1 strategic misinformation program. The USA is its lowest competitive military posture since Gettysburg. We have not had the sovereignty of the United States threatened since Gettysburg, like we have today. Media control of public opinion, present program in 1957, this was after the McCarthy hearings and all, communism was getting a bad name. So in 1957, there was to be no, this was on a global basis, there was to be no more card-carrying communist people anywhere. Everybody's told to go to church, go join the church, get within the church, go to seminary, and work within a church organization in your subversive efforts. Now, big money is out there supporting political subversion. Foreign money, I might add, as we've seen in the last election. Well, here's some favorable points that I'd like to point out. The majority of the citizens in this country wish to see this country prosper. And for my involvement in the political process, I'm utterly convinced that this is true. Our private enterprise system is resourceful and resilient, but it is getting less and less resilient. The Constitution provides for a Republican form of self-government. New technology and communications can be used to bypass media control, and I think that is being done. You find more people informed about a lot of things I've been talking about here tonight, today, than you ever have in the past. There's a vast resource of people who can be informed, organized, and motivated. I think that is an improvement over and over. Our enemies would succumb if we stop supporting them. Grassroots can prevail over high-tech campaigns, high-tech dollars. When you have people out there with lots of money and no grassroots, then you can spend an infinite amount of money and media time and mailings and win a campaign. But if you have a very strong grassroots organization, organized right down to the individual voter, I don't care how much media control or media money you have out there, you can't beat grassroots. And it's the only way you're going to turn this thing around is grassroots politics. I'm writing down in the last couple of charts. The yoke is just about to come around my neck. There's a defector who's been running around the United States, former agent, former colonel in the Russian Military Intelligence Service, it's GRU. He wrote this book, Through the Eyes of the Enemy. He has been propagandizing these things. America's facing a nation of gangsters, the mafia knows the control. Cold War is still in play and going on much more dangerous ways. The mafia controls the government in the Soviet Union. Special agents entering the United States as foreign tourists, locating sites for pre-deployment of suitcase-type bombs. Well, he has been propagandizing. He has been saying these things since he has been over here. I read his book. I have engaged him several times in conversation, and one time, I think the first time I engaged him, I said, throughout your book you have lent credibility to the Sino-Soviet split. And he accepted it. He said, well, obviously you've read my book. And I pointed out that I wrote a book in 1967, which I concluded the Sino-Soviet split was a hoax, one of the highest payoff strategies the communist world ever implemented. I said, Anatoly Golitsyn wrote a book in 1985 called New Lies for Old, where he said the Sino-Soviet split was a strategic disinformation program. And in the perestroika section in 1995, he said the Sino-Soviet split was the key disinformation program on which all other strategic disinformation programs depended. I said, are you out there trying to re-propagandize the Sino-Soviet split? And he was a little embarrassed by my question, because this was in the Rayburn building. It was probably 200 or 300 people in the Senate and House staffers. And he turned around, faced the back wall, and he turned back around slowly, and he said, my comments about the Sino-Soviet split were made in the context by which the Sino-Soviet split was interpreted at the time about which I was writing. Do you get that? So if it was a phony, if it was a hoax then, it was a hoax whatever time he was writing. Now, if you look at this, he has been saying that we have all these bombs deployed over here. The Soviet Union is split up, and it is run by the mafia. Where's your accountability? And these bombs, demolition charges are being sold in the underworld and put over here, pre-deployed in the United States. And you hear about 3 of them, or 1 of them, or 5 of them. Actually, the Soviet Union has thousands. And you have drug traffic coming in from Colombia and all over daily. How many do we have in this country? Do we have any? The problem is this. Where during the Cold War, if you want to call it a Cold War, we had strategic deterrence. We had a capability against the Soviet Union and China. They had a capability against us. And it was so severe, neither one was going to break that. The communist world, they have a plan to win without an atomic war, and they're not going to do anything to jeopardize their program, because they have a plan and a program to win. So they're not going to do it too much. But now, where you have the Soviet Union, you're admitting, or trying to admit in this country, that the Soviet Union no longer exists, and the mafia, irresponsible crowd running things and selling these weapons over here to the mafia people over here who are putting them out. Do you realize you do not any longer have deterrence against the deployment and use of atomic weapons against you? That's a whole cold, hard fact. It's the first time I have ever been concerned about nuclear weapons being used against the United States. Their program was designed to transform the world in a systematic way to minimize their vulnerability. All these things, I have given you these strategies, but they phase them in a way to minimize vulnerability. I think this is the last chart. Wait. They plan to, once they get this World Commonwealth of Independent States, that they would be in a position to get rid of this choke point here, get control of the oil in the Middle East, and in Western Europe, they'd be able to strangle the economy of Western Europe by controlling this choke point and the oil in the Middle East. They'd be able to strangle the economy of Western Europe and to a certain extent the United States, and force a lot of the wars of national liberation that are in the preparatory phase or period of escalating violence into the period of escalating violence. Where they say, like the United States, they use an analogy of the United States would be like a bull firing in a china closet. So in many places, and today we're in how many countries? Over 100. We have troops in over 100 different countries. But the program was in consolidating power. They had planned to establish this first power base in France. And when Napoleon got kicked out of Moscow, they changed their mind and decided they had to have some defense in depth. And they decided to establish their first power base in Russia, then take Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, Southeast China, and then Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa north of the Sahara, and move on from there in that sequence. And then they would precipitate all these wars of national liberation, move the ones that were remaining into the period of escalated violence. And we're not too far away from simultaneously moving most of the rest of the Western Hemisphere into the period of escalated violence. What's the solution to this problem? I know but one solution, and that's the American people have to take back the political process in this country. If there's anybody in here who can come up with another solution, I'd like to hear it. I do not know of another solution to change things besides going out and taking back the political process in this country, and it starts down at the precinct level. First, it has to be organized top-down. You have to organize top-down, but the working place is at the precinct. In Fairfax County, we had over 2 congressional districts in the Fairfax County Republican Party. The county committee has seats about 500 people. Can you imagine running by Robert's rule a committee of 500 people, unless a third of them would like to see you hanged, the other 2/3 are supporting proposition. But if the precinct chairman can be a leader, and he can organize and recruit 35 block captains who can be leaders, one for about every 25 homes or 30 homes, then you can have an organized structure in a precinct, and you multiply that and say in Fairfax County by 225, you have an organization that can deliver the vote. And I don't care how much media control, media and money the other candidate has, if you have that kind of an organization, you can win elections. I think that's the last chart. But my comment from all I've had to say, I know of one way we're going to turn this country back, and that is to take back the political process. And thank you for your time and God bless you.